I'm Jane O'Brien in Washington, and this is BBC World News America. Ukrainian soldiers are facing a fierce battle in the country's eastern Donbass region. As Russian forces are closing in, we report from the front lines. The UN warns authorities in Sri Lanka against using excessive force to break up peaceful protests. Colombia holds its first round of elections as it prepares to pick a new president. The two candidates have radically different visions. And the King of Jordan sits down with the BBC to share his thoughts on Queen Elizabeth as she prepares to celebrate 70 years on the throne. Welcome to World News America on PBS and around the globe. We begin tonight in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. It's a part of the country where most people speak Russian, and before the war, many residents had a favourable view of Moscow. That has changed as the war in Ukraine has worsened. When Russia failed to capture major cities in Ukraine's north, the strategy shifted and forces descended on the Donbass. A number of cities there have already been captured, and today Russian troops entered the city of Severodonetsk. It's one of the last big cities Ukraine still controls in the region. Our correspondent Jeremy Bowen and cameraman Fred Scott have sent this report from Bakhmut, a frontline town that could become one of Russia's next objectives.
Life was never easy in Donbass. At least it was familiar. Now the war is getting closer to their care home, and it's time to go. These women have no families to support them. One of the Ukrainian volunteers said the Russian soldiers are worse than animals. We can't leave these women behind. They're taking them west, out of Donbass, away from the Russian advance. A Russian strike did this close by in Bakhmut. Most of the residents had evacuated by the time it was hit last week. The man who lived in this flat left the day before. Civilians here fear the Russians will take all of Donbass, including their town. Roman and Marina want to stay, but it's getting lonely, with the destructive power of the Russian army on their doorstep.
So far, we made that decision, but if it gets too bad, then I don't know. We want to stay here. We want peace. We want our child to go to school here normally. We'll rebuild the city.
Sonia, their daughter, turned 8 this month. Her school closed when the Russians invaded. Online lessons are part of a wall of normality her parents are trying to build around her. It's looking very fragile. Just down the road is a glimpse of the future they dread. The Russians are around 5 miles away. They're hitting Bakhmut regularly, but not constantly yet. Doggedly, civilians clutch at routine as their old lives disappear. The town waits on big decisions. For the few civilians left about leaving or staying, how to survive. But also for the Ukrainian army. Some powerful American-made howitzers have just arrived, but not enough to stop the Russian advance into Severodonetsk. Ukraine's generals must decide how many more troops to sacrifice in what could be a losing battle for this part of Donbass. A fighting retreat to more defensible positions looks likely if the Russian offensive doesn't stall. New trench networks well back from the existing front line are ready. Kramatorsk, one of the Donbass towns that must be on the Russian target list, is about 15 minutes drive that way. Rest of Ukraine is there. This might all simply be just in case, a contingency plan, but if the Russians do blast their way through, they're going to need it. Maxim Lutzik's unit was ordered to retreat closer to Bakhmut after weeks of heavy fighting. He's one of thousands of Ukrainian volunteers.
All the aircraft bombing.
Back in Kiev, just after the invasion, he signed up with his friend Dmitro.
I am studying economy.
And I'm studying biology.
The two students fought in the victory in Kiev. Dmitro's still there. Ukrainians have to put aside the deliverance they felt then. In Donbass, Maxim, 19 years old, is in an attritional struggle.
We were defending the Zara chemical factory. I think that there is no way to make a deal with Putin. Putin understands only the language of bullets, blood, war crimes.
Air raid sirens were sounding as they prepared to bury Serhiy Verpeka, a 21-year-old Ukrainian soldier. Since the invasion, this war has had terrible consequences, and not just in Ukraine. Serhiy Verpeka and thousands more Ukrainians and Russians are dead. The killing here has brought the big nuclear-armed powers closer to confrontation than since the height of the Cold War. Millions are refugees. A wider war is a clear risk. More destruction, hunger, poverty, and more funerals are a certainty. War is the bringer of grief and change. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Donbass.
Well, joining me now is retired Admiral James Stavridis, who formerly served as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. He also is the author of To Risk It All. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Admiral, what happens if Russia does gain full control of the whole of the Donbass? What impact will that have on the war?
I think it would bring us to an inflection point, potentially, that could lead to a negotiation. And of course, the decision to negotiate has to have two sides to it. Question one, would it be sufficient for Vladimir Putin? And let us recall, his initial objective was to take the entire country. If he ends up succeeding in taking Donetsk, Luhansk, the Donbass, that's about 15%. So is he willing to negotiate? And I think more importantly, from the perspective of the West, are the Ukrainians willing to negotiate after living through the scenes that were illuminated so brilliantly by your reporting a moment ago? A lot of blood has been spilled, a lot of atrocities committed. Are the Ukrainians willing to negotiate? Either way, I think if Putin consolidates control over Donbass, it will be an inflection point where both sides will at least consider a negotiation.
Is it a situation that NATO would be comfortable with?
I think NATO's been very consistent in its position, which I think is a correct one, which is that we ought to give the Ukrainians the tools they need to stand at a negotiating table successfully. If they decide that they want to continue to fight and try and expel Russia from every inch of Ukraine, that is their right as a sovereign state, and I think we ought to support that. On the other hand, if they're willing to accede to a loss of some territory in order to attain an armistice, think Korea at the end of the Korean War, a continuing state of war, but both sides across a divided line. If that is acceptable to Ukraine, it will be acceptable to the West. They're not a proxy for us, as some have said. They're fighting their own sovereign battle. We're supporting them. I think we'll support whatever decision they take.
In terms of support, President Biden said today that there are certain weapons that he won't give to Ukraine because they might be fired into Russian territory. Are these distinctions still important?
I think they are, but the allies, NATO, if you will, the West, have been moving steadily to provide stronger and stronger weapons. They are still of a nature to be defensive. So these are the kind of, for example, cruise missiles that might be used to attack Russian ships at sea, the howitzer that your reporter showed a moment ago. These are weapons that can be used offensively, but they are still less provocative, less confrontational than long-range land, surface-to-surface cruise missiles that could strike major cities inside of Russia. I think that's where President Biden is seeking to form a line between long-range systems and those that are most effective on the battlefield.
Admiral Stavridis, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
My pleasure.
The UN has warned authorities in Sri Lanka against using excessive force to break up largely peaceful protests occurring across the country. Many of the demonstrators are calling for top government officials to resign as a bad economic crisis continues to grow even worse. For weeks, police have been accused of employing a heavy-handed response, often using tear gas and water cannons to disperse crowds that are acting peacefully. Our South Asia correspondent Rajini Vaidyanathan has more and a warning. Her report does contain some distressing images.
As Sri Lankans take to the streets over food and fuel shortages, accusations the police is using excessive force to silence them. In the small town of Rambukana, a protest at a petrol station turns tense. Police fire tear gas and live rounds to disperse the crowd. A father of two shot in the stomach. Chaminda Lakshan sold fruit and vegetables to support his family.
He took this truck.
He told his wife Priyangani he'd gone to get fuel. Hours later, she was called to the hospital.
They told me he had been shot. I looked everywhere for him. Then I found him on a trolley. He was dead.
More than a dozen others were injured, including police officers. One of the youngest victims, 15-year-old Sahan.
And this one says gunshot.
He'd gone to see the protest after school.
Tear gas was fired. Then I was shot. Something struck my arm and I saw blood gushing.
4 policemen are being held over the shooting. The UN's warned against the excessive use of tear gas and water cannons to disperse demonstrators, urging Sri Lanka's government to guarantee the right to peaceful protest.
We were worried about our lives.
Law student Nirashan Wetanaga was peacefully demonstrating with a group outside Parliament, rounded up by police.
They forcefully dragged our friends into the bus. We asked, why are we being taken away?
The group faced charges of criticising the president. Echoes of tactics allegedly used by Sri Lanka's security forces during the country's civil war.
We did nothing wrong, nothing illegal. We were all terrified at how the police is misusing the law to oppress people that were rising up against the government.
We asked the Sri Lankan authorities for a response, but didn't receive a reply.
This isn't the first time that allegations of police brutality have surfaced in Sri Lanka. The country's had a long history of accusations of brutality committed by the security forces, in particular during the decades-long civil war, which saw members of the country's minority Tamil community targeted in particular.
Successive Sri Lankan governments have been intolerant of dissent.
Human rights groups say these latest cases follow a long pattern of the government cracking down on free speech, a charge it's consistently denied.
Which is to prevent people from exercising their freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all of which, what is the purpose, ultimate purpose? Stay in power.
Priyangani's still searching for justice.
This is a memorial to Chaminda.
In an economic crisis which has plunged Sri Lankans into despair, many wonder whether they're losing their democratic rights too. Rajini Vaidyanathan, BBC News, Rambukana, Sri Lanka.
OK, let's take a quick look at some of the day's other news now. And an official in the Indian state of Punjab has said he will request a judge to investigate the death of Sidhu Moosewala, a singer and politician who was murdered on Sunday. The Punjabi singer, who was accused of promoting gun violence, was shot dead after his security had been curtailed by authorities. The United Nations today announced that gangs are exploiting political instability in Myanmar to ramp up drug production and trafficking. It comes as a record 1 billion methamphetamine pills were seized in East and Southeast Asia last year. The increase has caused the street price of narcotics to fall significantly, hitting all-time lows in Thailand and Malaysia. Authorities in the Chinese city of Shanghai have announced some COVID lockdown measures will be lifted from Wednesday. The Chinese financial hub has been under restrictions for the past 2 months, which has led to nearly 25 million people being forced to stay at home. And Top Gun Maverick, the sequel to the 1986 blockbuster, has made an estimated $151 million in the United States over the weekend. The film, which has Tom Cruise reprising his iconic role, also represents the highest grossing debut of Cruise's career. Now, this weekend, tens of thousands of people in Jerusalem marched through the city's Muslim quarter as part of an annual parade organised by Israeli nationalists. Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem see the parade as a major provocation. Our Middle East correspondent Tom Bateman was on the ground during the parade, which at times turned violent. He sent us this report.
Young Israelis sing of their love for Jerusalem. To them, their undivided capital. But the songs drown out this city's bitter realities. And the symbols, for some, are more about a show of supremacy than a place to share. There's no such thing as Palestinians, says Nadia. There's such a thing as Jews, and they have neighbours. If they want to come, they're welcome. But Israel was always ours. Tens of thousands of religious nationalists marched into occupied East Jerusalem, a massively controversial route with one of the biggest ever turnouts. And Palestinians were moved to make way for the marchers.
Well, the Palestinians are being cleared from this area. They were just sitting at a cafe here, but the border police are making clear it will only be Israelis getting anywhere near to here. And it's why this day in particular emphasises to Palestinians the profound sense, the lack of rights that they feel they have. We're going to go. Thank you.
And there were violent confrontations as the marchers made their way through the Muslim quarter. A provocation, say Palestinians like Mohammed, who just came to meet old friends. The Israeli government lets them come down to give us a headache, he tells me. They provoke anyone in the street. They hit. Look, this is not right. Some marchers shouted death to Arabs and other racist chants. But there was little visible police response. The biggest fear on days like this is around the most combustible site, Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, known to Jews as Temple Mount. Holy to all, Jews can visit, 2,500 did, said to be the biggest ever number in a day. And some prayed, breaching sensitive and long-standing arrangements. Palestinian militant groups had earlier threatened to act if red lines, as they called them, were crossed here. But it didn't spill over like last year, when the day became the final trigger for an 11-day war. It comes, though, after months of violence and growing concerns the region is on the verge of much more. Tom Bateman, BBC News, Jerusalem.
We turn now to Colombia, where voters are in the process of picking the country's next president. Yesterday was the first round of voting. The final round will take place early next month. For years, Colombian politics has been dominated by the legacy of a decades-long war that saw far-left guerrillas fighting against the country's conservative government. Since the conflict formally ended in 2016, Conservatives have been in control of the country's politics. But now, after the first round of voting, The leading candidate for the president is a former leftist rebel. Our South America correspondent Katie Watson has more.
While Colombia is no stranger to political violence, the elections on Sunday took place peacefully. But the results were a break with the past. People here made it pretty clear they're fed up with traditional politics and they want something different, something that works for them.
I'm completely sure that the votes will be in favour of the real change Colombia needs. We have been asking for it for over 60 years, and we can have the hope of a better future for our beloved country.
The truth is we want a change in our country, and we need to go out and exercise our right to vote to get the changes we want so badly.
Gustavo Petro was the front-runner all along, a leftist former mayor and self-labelled revolutionary who promised huge economic and social changes, improving the inequality and fixing the violence in the country.
It's a relatively simple election, to leave things as they are in Colombia, which in my opinion would mean more corruption, violence and hunger, or to change Colombia and take it towards peace, prosperity and democracy for the people.
Polls have put Conservative candidate Fico Gutierrez behind Petro, but that wasn't to be. Instead, this man, Rodolfo Hernandez, will go head-to-head with Petro next month. A populist businessman turned politician, dubbed Colombia's Trump. He's a savvy social media user who managed to reach young voters. The two men are political extremes. If Mr. Petro wins the second round, he'll be the first leftist leader that Colombia has ever had, and his running mate, the environmentalist Francia Marquez, would become the nation's first black vice president. But Gustavo Petro will have a tough job on his hands. In a country that's been racked by decades of civil war, Colombia's conservatives are afraid of a sharp turn to the left, and they're expected to back Rodolfo Hernandez in the second round. Katie Watson, BBC News.
Now, later this week, Queen Elizabeth will celebrate her Platinum Jubilee, marking 70 years on the throne. Ahead of the celebrations, the BBC had an exclusive interview with the King of Jordan, who described the Queen as a beacon of light. Both the King and his late father had a close relationship with Queen Elizabeth. Our royal correspondent Daniela Relf has more from Amman in Jordan.
The crowded landscape of Amman in Jordan. For generations, the bond between this country's royal family and British royalty has been strong. Something the current King of Jordan, Abdullah II, reflected on as we spoke about his lifelong family friend, the Queen.
As King, you are in a unique position to observe the reign of another monarch. I wonder how you view the Queen's 70 years on the throne.
I think with a lot of humility. My late father, His Majesty King Hussein, became a monarch the same year as Her Majesty. And the special relationship that they had is something that we inherited and we grew up with. But to think of what she has seen in her life and the standard that she has, I think, held as a monarch is an example for all of us. So for me, it's just, I'm honored to be part of that story, to have seen that special relationship between my father and her, between myself and Her Majesty, and His Royal Highness Prince Charles, and now a wonderful young man, Prince William, who's a friend of my son. So this is a historical relationship that we're very, very proud of.
What are the attributes that she has that have largely made her reign so successful?
I think, you know, when you look at Her Majesty, you look at consistency, and I think putting the moral bar at the highest point possible. She has dedicated herself to the monarchy and to the people. And as we have all experienced, sometimes you say things or have to take positions that may not necessarily be popular, but is the right thing. And I think that moral compass, if you look at her reign, is I think what has really made her shine compared to monarchies elsewhere.
Daniela Relf reporting there. And before we go tonight, we have one final story from Peru, where a team of archaeologists have discovered a never-before-seen network of passageways that were hidden beneath a 3,000-year-old temple. The Shavin Dewanta temple, which is buried deep in the Andes Mountains, was once a religious hub for people across the region. And these sets of tunnels are believed to have been built at far earlier times than some other parts of the temple. That's all we have for you tonight. Thank you very much indeed for watching BBC World News America with me, Jane O'Brien.